This is the Keys to the Kingdom podcast, where we explore how the psychedelic renaissance becomes accessible to everyone. I'm your host, Tammy Sanders, and I'm glad you're with us. Thanks so much for listening. Danny Motyka joins this conversation as the CEO of PsyGen Labs, a Canada-based manufacturer of pharmaceutical-grade psychedelics for clinical research and therapeutic use. Since he was a teenager tackling severe depression with psilocybin and LSD, Danny's aim has been to improve access to psychedelics. His keys to psychedelics access are educated chemistry and mission-driven business. In this conversation, Danny and I discuss changing the nature of business with psychedelics, understanding our drug biases, and moving ourselves beyond our default modes. Danny, thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate having some time with you.
Thank you so much for having me on, Tammy. It's a pleasure.
I first need to start with your hair, Danny. I don't think many people get to see this. You gonna
What,
share
this whole
that?
thing? Oh, I don't even know. I'd have to
Yeah,
take off my Zoom background.
yeah, you have to take off your Zoom. Actually, bring it around to the front. Can you bring it around to the front?
Does that work?
Oh wow, look at that. Look at that. That's how long have you been growing that braid? That's amazing. That thing has to be like 2 feet long, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's about 2.5 feet long at this point. This time around, it's about 6 years. I go through cycles every 5 or 6 years. I cut my hair off. The last time was when I bought a house and moved in with my wife. I was planning on cutting my hair off this time when my son was born, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I'm too attached this time. So
that's a lot of history to carry around. When I turned 30, I locked my hair and I grew my locks and kept them until I turned 40. And then when I turned 40, I cut it all off to within an inch. I think I still have my locks in storage somewhere. I think I have them in a bag in storage. Do you keep your hair when you cut it?
So the last time that I cut it off, I donated it to Kids with Wigs. The first time was when I had dreadlocks, actually, from 15 until 21. I cut those off and I buried them in the soil of some cannabis plants that I grew. So I ended up smoking those locks.
That is awesome. Oh my God,
Yeah,
you smoked your hair. That's fantastic.
I quite enjoyed that.
Yeah, I mean, that is so full circle. I love that. That's a beautiful, I'm serious. That's a beautiful thing to do with the history and the life that is represented in that hair. That's a really beautiful thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason that I grew my locks in the first place is when I was a teenager and I just discovered psilocybin mushrooms. Actually, I discovered the Rasta belief that your karma and your spirit kind of grow out into your hair, and the more time that you spend working on your dreadlocks, it was kind of time to meditate and spend with yourself. And that you reach these critical points in your life where it's time to shed your karma and those memories that you've collected. And so that's I guess where I've shaved my head twice now, and I'm just waiting to gain the confidence to shave it a third time.
I agree with that. The notion that you do have this history that you're carrying, these experiences that you're carrying. I think that's why I actually let my hair go when I turned 40, because it was just time to let go of those memories and time to let go of that phase in my life that, being in my 30s and all the things that I went through in my 30s, it was time to let those things go.
How long did it take until you looked in the mirror?
After I cut it?
Yeah.
I actually cut it myself. So
okay.
And that was a cathartic and deeply personal exercise to actually cut my locks myself, each one by hand, and put them in a place where I would keep them and I would store them. And then I promptly put on a hoodie, put the hoodie up, tied it really tight, and then drove to the hairdresser and said, "Could you please fix what I have just done? I would really appreciate that."
Awesome. Yeah, I let my wife cut them off, and I don't think I looked in the mirror for at least 40 hours. I was
really,
I just had this identity crisis. I had no idea what I would look like or who I was, and kept slamming my head into hard surfaces, thinking that I'd have the protection of my dreadlocks, which I no longer had.
I need to let go of the whole notion of you slamming your head into hard surfaces, because that just sounds, it sounds hard. It sounds painful. But hopefully you've got yourself to a place where you understand, you sort of grow into your hair as you grow into your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So Danny, thank you for joining us, particularly in this conversation about psychedelics access. Given the work that you do, it is critical to psychedelics access, being the CEO of PsyGen. We'll have links to PsyGen and people can get to know it a little bit, and I've heard you talking about the origin of PsyGen and sort of how you came to lead the company. But I am curious. I just want to hear, when you think about PsyGen as a contributor to the psychedelics ecosystem, what is it you most want people to understand about the company, and what is it you most want people to understand about you as a CEO of that company when you think about PsyGen as a contributor to the psychedelics ecosystem?
Well, I think the most important thing about PsyGen is really just that, we were formed with the mission to improve access to psychedelic drug substances. And it's really just because we believe that they have this potential to transform the way that our species is currently living. And I think that for us, it goes a lot further than just mental health. I think that it's really important to start with mental health, but we do really want to see the psychedelic movement transform how we as a society view drug laws and education. And hopefully in the next 10 years we're going to live in a much healthier society.
Hmm. Okay. And what about you as the CEO of PsyGen? And we'll get to your personal story in just a
Yeah.
bit, but as a CEO of a psychedelics company, what do you want to be known for in terms of contributing to the ecosystem?
I think that I want to be known for doing something a little bit different, in the sense that this business is not for monetary gain. We're looking, when we've put this business opportunity together, we didn't want to have to choose between doing well and doing good. We believe that we can do well by doing good, and that, for us, it's really more about the mission to improve access to psychedelics and less about just generating crazy returns for shareholders. Something that has, I guess, challenged me through my personal development is just seeing, I guess, what I consider as the darker side of capitalism. I definitely recognize that capitalism is a very profound ideology that has led to a lot of growth and innovation, but often at the expense of, I guess, at the expense of the retail shareholders that end up buying in at the very top and just watch the stock come crashing down. And so I think from my perspective, I'm hoping that PsyGen can be a long-term growth story, and it can be sustainable, um, and it can help to redefine what success in business means.
Gotcha. And we'll call that capitalism's shadow side, right? Because
Yeah.
that's the landscape that we're in, where there is this shadow side, the problematic elements of capitalism, which are exploitative and um, certainly do not contribute to the sort of productive ways of being human. Um, it's interesting to have you talk about sort of buying at the very top of the market. Psygen actually did have recently a pretty important announcement. Actually, I want to have you speak to that to make sure I don't say anything that I'm not supposed to say.
Yeah, so I believe that you're just talking about our announcement to RTO into a shell corp. So we're planning on taking the company public.
Hmm.
This was a tough decision for us because both Peter and I, as the co-founders, had intended to keep PsyGen private for as long as possible.
And why is that?
Um,
Why is that?
just because I am fearful of going public and then having to focus primarily on shareholder value and quarter over quarter growth instead of the mission that PsyGen is focused on. And I
Mhm.
felt that if we were able to stay private and we were able to find investors that could support us in our vision and our mission, we would just have a little bit more freedom to operate. Um, the decision to go public is really just that there's so much interest in the psychedelic space right now that investors are basically throwing money at an opportunity for liquidity, and there's so much speculation in the market that it is driving really great returns for early shareholders. So, marketing and selling the deal of a private company was quite a bit harder than marketing a deal that has a promise of a great return. And so in order to, I guess, take advantage of the unique place in this high growth market, we've decided to take the company public and access that capital that's really stimulating the growth of this new and emerging industry.
Gotcha. Will PsyGen be available to retail investors in the US, or is it going to be listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange? Because PsyGen is Canada based, correct?
Correct. So initially we will be looking to list on the Toronto Stock Exchange, the Toronto Venture Stock Exchange. We will explore eligibility to list on one of the United States exchanges, but initially we're just focused on the TSXV.
Okay. So I don't know, maybe that's the reason you all have been exempt from this. Maybe, we just believe the Canadians are nicer and so we don't pick on y'all as much. But, there has been a lot of upset and critical and intense conversation around and polarizing conversation around capitalism in psychedelics. And PsyGen is about to go public, which is one of the most capitalist things you can do as a company. But when I was prepping for our conversation, I researched PsyGen, I looked on social media, and I just don't see people yelling about y'all. I don't see anyone yelling at you. I don't see anyone yelling about you. Why is it that you think, PsyGen isn't getting as much, I don't know, just critique for being a capitalist entity in the psychedelic space?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in part it could be due to the lack of promotion so far. We have not been engaged in, pre-market promotional activities where we're just driving traffic and awareness to PsyGen. I definitely expect there to be a polarizing view. I mean, the psychedelic community, I refer to it as if it's homogenous, but there's a lot of people, I would say there's a lot of sub communities within psychedelics that perceive capitalism as a negative force in the world.
Like
and so there's
inherently
negative.
Yeah.
And, whereas I believe that most things are polarized and you're going to find groups of people that are supportive and groups of people that are going to be against us. So I would expect that as more people learn about the PsyGen deal and who we are as a company, we'll have lovers and we'll have haters. It's my hope that through marketing PsyGen's, I guess, philanthropic attitude, that we really want to give back to the community, that we'll be able to win the favor of some of the population that will be against capitalist ventures. And just to speak a little bit more to that, we recognize that the foundations of this industry have really been built on the hard work of nonprofit organizations and research foundations like MAPS and the Hefter Institute. And so, in recognizing the roots of this industry, we just want to do what we can to give back and make sure that we can foster a sustainable ecosystem.
Yeah. How are you envisioning that in practice? And particularly if you think about PsyGen is very much focused on producing psilocybin. Psilocybin is a plant, grows, freely, doesn't need anyone to produce it. PsyGen comes along, starts producing it, makes a lot of money out of that, so to speak, becomes a publicly traded company, investors are cashing in. So I'm just curious sort of your reconciliation about that as a CEO of a company that is producing psychedelics that, some of which are very freely available. I mean, the DMT crystals behind you, that's another one that's naturally occurring. So what does it look like to give back, and what does it look like to contribute positively, particularly while you all are scaling the availability of psychedelics, which certainly has very positive ramifications for access?
So I think to us, giving back is really, and I've been following a lot of conversations lately about reciprocity and what it means in the psychedelic ecosystem, and whether companies should have an obligation to, I guess, reciprocate and give back to the community. And for PsyGen, when we established our corporate values, it was really about this. It was about financial reciprocity. So recognizing that the hard work of MAPS and the research that has been supported by the Hefter Institute and other research organizations has only been made possible through philanthropic donations.
Mhm.
And so in that, PsyGen has committed to donating up to 10% of our revenues back into these types of nonprofits and research foundations in
No,
hopes that we can.
you're not gonna freak your investors out. 10%? You're not gonna freak your investors out. What do you think about that, Danny?
So I think that if we were to announce that after we had raised all this capital, sure, people would get freaked out. But
Yeah.
we have marketed PsyGen as a philanthropic organization from day one. And so I
Mm.
think that, all investors have been aware of what our interests are. Um, it's, you know, certainly I think that it's going to limit our opportunities. There's going to be investors and institutions that are going to pass on the deal because they look at it as cash out of their pocket. But we have been looking for investors that are aligned with impact investing since the very beginning. And so, my belief, or my hope, is that the psychedelic industry is going to be transformative in business and capitalism as well, and that we can start to help develop these, I guess new, these, there's huge capital pools for profit companies and for go public companies, and it's all about the return. And there's less obvious capital pools for impact investors, but they do exist. They're out there. And so my hope is that with psychedelics and the more and more companies that look to bring impact investment opportunities to the table, that will start to build these capital resource pools for this kind of narrative to help support more companies that are looking to do, I guess, a social benefit type platform.
Yeah.
And PsyGen is not technically a social benefit corporation because in Canada we don't have a federal incorporation that is consistent with that. So we're just a regular incorporated company, but we do have the intention of kind of acting like a social benefit corporation and publishing an annual report about all of the philanthropic and social responsibility programs that we're developing and initiating.
Gotcha. I'm sure people will be keeping an eye on that for you as well, and will have feedback for you if they feel like you're not going in a direction that reflects that as well as it should. It's interesting. Two things out of what you've just said there. The notion that psychedelics are profoundly impactful for individuals aligns with the notion that psychedelic businesses can be profoundly impactful for society and for the nature of doing business. It sounds like you want to lead with your chin on that one. You want to actually sort of stand out in front and see, like, essentially, let's see if that we can make that a reality, right? That psychedelic businesses can actually change society as much as psychedelics can transform individuals. That's one thing I hear out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the nature of I guess human evolution that it's right now we're evolving ideas, and um, psychedelic medicines and this industry that's evolving, we as thought leaders now in the space, we get to go onto the stage and we get to give people what we think and what our ideas are. And if those ideas get enough momentum behind them, then I certainly believe that the development of the psychedelic ecosystem and industry can help to shift business landscape. Whether or not that's going to transfer to other industries, I'm not sure, but it's not like this is a new idea. There's, Patagonia has been a social benefit corporation for decades, and
Yeah.
there are countless other examples.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. From Ben and Jerry's to Cliff Bar, there's a
Yeah,
lot of examples out there, no matter how they're structured, of companies who have said we want social values to be at the heart of how we do business.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And the second thing that comes to mind is something I learned playing dominoes from my dad and all his old man friends is all money ain't good money. That there's a lot of money out there, but it sounds like you don't want all of it. You just want the good money.
yeah, absolutely. And hopefully, we're never forced into a position where we don't have a choice between good money and maybe the money with all the strings attached.
Yeah, gotcha, gotcha.
Yeah.
So, Danny, when you and I first uh, connected with each other, I was like, dude, you make drugs. Like
We'll make
that
drugs.
that's what you do. You're like a dude who makes drugs. Like, how do you, I mean, there are people going to prison for that. Like, how do you grow up to be the CEO of a company that intends to make drugs?
Well, for me, it's always been a very personal mission. I suffered from severe depression as a teenager, and I experienced this, um, the profound messages that psilocybin had to offer, and subsequently LSD. And I got to look at how conventional SSRI medications and bipolar worked in some people that were very close to me. And then I got to experience my own personal history of psychedelic medicine. And, you know, I basically set that intention when I was 16 years old that I want to do something to help improve access to psychedelics. I can see firsthand that these are medicines that have real potential. I don't understand why they're not available to people as a treatment option. So going through high school, chemistry just became really natural to me. I struggled with social studies. I struggled with English, but for some reason, mathematics and chemistry just, was second nature to me. So I therefore decided that, and also, through reading about Albert Hoffman and Alexander Shulgin, I always kind of romanticized this idea of becoming a psychedelic chemist. So I went to university with the intention of becoming a psychedelics manufacturer one day. I always wanted to do it above ground.
So,
and
wait, I have to pause you here because
yeah,
it's what's really interesting is, I say, most kids would never think about this, but you're like, nope, this is exactly what I was thinking about as a kid, right? Like this is exactly who I was as a kid. So how does a 16-year-old come to know that, like, how did you come to understand psychedelics so profoundly in the first place as a teenager? Did you do this on your own? Was it you and the internet? Was it you and people and were you in community or in guidance with other people? Like, how did you actually come to understand this at such a young age?
yeah, I mean, I think Arrowwood was my best friend. I had done so much research. I always was a little bit um, drawn to spirituality. And so, when I was struggling with depression and anxiety, I was looking online for kind of what all of this meant. I was always very curious about death. Death has followed me through my life starting very early. I had a lot of people that were close to me die. And when I was 13, my father was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. So I was forced to think about mortality from a very young age. And so then when I was struggling with depression and I was looking at treatment options, and I've always been kind of cautious of Western medicine. I discovered psychedelics, and I discovered the profound, I guess, death rebirth experiences that so many people got to experience. And yeah, it just seemed like, I think that a combination of the internet and Arrowwood were my best friends. And there was just something that was so fascinating about the chemistry and how many molecules were so similar, just differing by an atom or a
Like
single function, just one functional group. And,
yeah.
they would just result in such profound differences in consciousness. It just, yeah, I found it so fascinating from a very young age.
Now, there's something that you're saying was your best friend, and I'm not catching it. Can you say it
Oh,
again and just sort
Arrowwood.
of?
Yeah, Arrowwood is like an online resource. Um, it has, I don't know, I would consider it, and maybe I'm ignorant, maybe there was something that came before Arrowwood, but it was essentially an online resource for, I would say, drug policy reform. They have, character vault with all of these characters throughout history and their relative contributions. I always looked at it as like a psychedelics hub, but there's definitely, any drug under the sun is on Arrowwood.
So it sounds like
Each
drugs Wikipedia.
Exactly. It was, and so like now I think that there's like what is it, like a psychopedia or something, which is essentially the Wikipedia of drugs, but Arrowwood was, you know, maybe a decade and a half. And yeah, it was all done by two people, Fire and Sun, and they did so much work to promote harm reduction, and they talk about the effects, the proper dosage to take, what you can expect from an experience, and then a whole archive of user experience reports, which were fascinating to read about as a teenager. I mean, Arrowwood was just, it's always been such an amazing free resource. They exist from donations, and yeah, awesome shirts. And I don't know, I think as soon as I had my first job when I was like 16 years old, started making, that was my first, I don't even know if they were a charitable foundation, but that was the first place that I would donate money to, because I just
Yeah.
believed in so strongly what they were doing.
What's interesting too is it sounds like right away you sort of recognize the importance of supporting the resources that are out there. So you didn't just sort of take from it; you also gave back to it, with your teen dollars.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And, I think that I was in a lucky place to be able to do that. By no means did I come from, a really rich family, but I definitely was, um, I had I had freedoms and I had liberties that I think, not everyone gets to experience. And so it was nice to be able to, donate $50 or $100 as a teenager, because that wasn't something that I had to think about saving.
Mm.
I always had that support to fall back on if necessary.
Yeah, that's one thing that's interesting too. We did talk about sort of coming from a place of privilege.
Yeah.
And, I do think that there are some people who are having reactionary response to the notion that there is privilege. It just, it's burdensome and it's problematized. You seem quite comfortable sort of talking about, coming from a place of privilege. I just wonder sort of how you got to that comfort, and what psychedelics might have had to do with
Mm.
that, in terms of you recognizing privilege and um, recognizing a responsibility with it.
Yeah, privilege is a really interesting conversation for me because absolutely I recognize that I come from a privileged place.
Like,
And
what does that actually mean when you say that, for example?
well, so for me, it means that I have had the freedom to make choices in my life to go to where I am. I've never felt like my decisions have been constrained or forced me to move one direction or another.
Mhm.
For example, when I was going to university, my aunt offered to basically pay for all of her nieces and nephews to study what they choose to study in. And
Wow.
had I ever, had I had to go and get student loans and I had to go and support myself through that and get a bunch of student debt, would I have had the freedom to study chemistry with the gamble that the psychedelic industry would evolve and that I would be able to, participate in that? Or would I have taken a more conservative route and said, I'd better go choose a safe option because I'm going to have
Mhm.
all of this debt that I have to go and pay back. Um, and then I think that the other piece of privilege is just recognizing, as someone who's got white skin, there's less risk of me being incarcerated um, for drug crimes and drug use. And that's, as much as I hate that that's the reality of the world that we live in, I recognize that it's the truth. And it's interesting, actually. The only time that I've experienced, I guess, I don't know if discrimination is the right word, but when I had dreadlocks, basically,
Mm.
I was targeted by the police,
Mhm.
and I was banned from the United States when I was 19, because I was entering the United States with dreadlocks, and they stopped me. They searched me for over 7 hours, and they knew that I must have cannabis on me. And after 7 hours, they kind of found this. They came back with this little baggie of a purple solution, which indicated there was the presence of THC in my car. And so, um, I have that experience, and I cannot begin to imagine what it would be like to have black skin and living in the United States. It's
Mm.
just, it's something that I've thought a lot about.
And very interesting. Was there actually THC in your car, or was that fabricated,
Oh,
or
there,
would they,
oh,
did
there
they, did they
must have
have
been
to,
THC in my
did they
car.
have to look
Absolutely.
real hard, or?
Yeah, I think that they ended up finding, like maybe some crumbs under the passenger seat of my vehicle or something.
Yeah.
There was no bud in my car. They
Yeah.
charged me with attempting to smuggle an immeasurable amount of cannabis into the United States, which sounds like I had so much they didn't have a scale big enough to weigh it on, but it
But it
was quite
actually
the
is the
opposite.
opposite. It was so
Yeah.
minute, you actually couldn't measure it.
Yeah.
God. Wow. Wow. That's pretty intense, man. And it's interesting because I do think that the stigma of dreadlocks is real. It is
Yeah.
real. It is interesting. We talked a little bit about Dr. Carl Hart,
Yeah.
who is the Columbia professor who wrote Drug Use for Grownups, and he is bringing a lot of positive and productive attention to uh, the drug decriminalization and drug legalization conversation. And he's a black man with dreadlocks, and it's almost like he had to be a black man with dreadlocks to lead this conversation. It's like the only way anyone's going to take what he has to say seriously. Most of the time the dreadlocks are working against you. In this, I think,
Yeah.
in this occasion it's actually working finally in someone's favor.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, sort of the assumptions that we come to with these sort of, surface level physical identifiers. When I had dreads, I actually had a member of my family say, I don't want you in my house with those things, because it was this symbol that I was sort of unclean, unkempt, and clearly like using drugs. So yeah, it was very interesting time. And I actually, one of the reasons I personally grew my dreadlocks is because I had had a conversation with a woman who had locks, and she said that she used them to ensure that she never made choices that went against her values, because she knew that people who weren't aligned with her values were going to come to assumptions about her based on her dreadlocks. And she wanted to like exempt herself from workplaces and exempt herself from environments where people weren't aligned with her values. So she came up with this sort of very visible symbol to kind of weed people out. And I was like, that's a great idea. And so I ended up doing the same thing, and it definitely kept me out of certain places that otherwise I could have weaseled my way in there undercover, but my dreadlocks didn't let me be undercover. So
that's brilliant. That's really fascinating.
Yeah. It's interesting because it looks like you really struggled to call it discrimination. With the notion that
Discrimination
maybe
is the word that I was looking for, but it's like it didn't apply or something, but that is exactly what it was. And what's strange is when I was in the Border Patrol office while they were searching my car, the only other groups of people that they would bring in were immigrants. Not a single other white person walked through that room.
Yeah. So it's like you and the immigrants. Well, you actually, I mean, you're a Canadian, so I guess you kind of count, but I totally get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. It's like you and the brown people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
and I think a point you're raising too is that, discrimination is not reserved for brown people. We get a lot of it. Maybe we get the bulk of it, or we get most of it. But sort of anyone outside of some sort of established system or code is subject to experience that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that it's not like the scales are tipped in a fair balance either. For example, when I was a teenager with dreadlocks, I was often the designated driver because I didn't really drink alcohol. I was more of a drug user on weekends. So when we'd go out dancing on the weekend, I was always DD. And a friend of mine had locked his keys in his van, so I was out with a coat hanger trying to get his van door open so that we could get his keys. And out of nowhere, 5 police cars all kind of came from both sides, got out, guns drawn, guns are on us. And I was sober, so I was like, oh, don't worry, I can handle this. And I walking over to the cops with my hands up. And I hate to think of what could have happened if I was a black person or a brown person. And maybe in Canada,
you would not have walked toward the police. I'll tell you that much. Don't walk
that's
toward the police. Yeah.
But it's a strange reality that if you don't quite look the part, then you will be discriminated against. And I hope that that's changing. I feel like maybe it's changing. I don't know. What do you think?
I too would hope that it's changing. But I was listening recently to some research about psychedelics and the brain, and how the default mode network in our brain is coming to very snap conclusions very quickly, because that's how our brains actually get us through everyday life. It takes in maybe like 20% of a situation and then comes to a lot of conclusions based on that 20% information that's new, and then 80% information that's stored. So until people either go into the default mode network and break apart and examine what they've stored and decide what has value and what they really need to let go of, until they've done that kind of examination, or until they put, lots of new information into their default mode network that may be unfamiliar and maybe contradictory to what they've already known. I think we still have a lot of folks coming to a lot of conclusions based on a lot of old information, a lot of antiquated information, and not doing this because they're bad people, they're malintentioned, none of that. Just doing it because it's the default mode.
Yeah, they've been psychologically primed.
Yeah. And I see it in a lot of different ways too, Danny, you know, where folks are like, I don't understand like why you're giving me a hard time about XYZ. You know, it's just the way that I think. I mean, I've always thought this way. Like, why is that a problem? Like just even people who have to start there, it can be really hard, especially like liberal progressive people. It can actually be really hard to tell liberal progressive people your ideas are antiquated, your ways of experiencing the world are antiquated, and you need to, you know, take a look at that. Like that can be a really hard pill to take for people who already think they're progressive. So yeah, I think from both sides, it's you know, whether you're on some conservative side of a spectrum or progressive side of a spectrum, I think we have a default mode. Our brains have a default mode, and there's still much work to do to move us
Yeah.
beyond that.
So it's just this generational process of constant improvement, but it takes generations.
Yeah, like and when I mean generations, I'm not talking about like millennials versus Gen Xers. I'm talking about like
Yeah.
new, I call it sort of new waves of humanity washing up on the shore. You know, just sort of
Yeah.
like the millennials washed up on the shore of humanity and started naming everything. That's a microaggression. That's a
Right.
non-gender conforming. You know, that, you know, they started naming things that, you know, my generation had never thought to name. That's, you know, we have to decolonize that. You know, that's white
Right.
supremacy. Like we weren't naming things that way. And then millennials washed up on the shore and started naming everything. And now I'm seeing Gen Zers, you know, washing up on the shore saying, I don't know if I want to participate in that. Like, you know, I just had a young man in my life who, for no reason other than, you know, he has experienced new ways of thinking, is saying, I'm not sure male and man really fit me. And I'm thinking about that now. Like just because he can,
Mm.
right? So I do have a sense that there are new notions coming and coming and coming pretty regularly. But yeah, there's still work to do.
Excuse me for 1 minute. I just need to get a blanket. I'm frozen in my basement office.
You're
I
in
will be right
You're in
back.
Canada, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, you feeling better?
Oh yes, much warmer. Thank you.
Okay, good, 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 good. All right. So you were I think you were about to ask me if I had read something.
Yeah, it's this book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Mm,
It's it's a really, I think it's a really important read in today's day and age, and it's just all about the rise of safetyism in America, but I think it's in Canada as well, and this idea that safetyism is basically perceiving the human mind as fragile when in reality we're anti-fragile, and that we've got a lot of that we're actually quite resilient, and that when we face adversity, it's important for us to be able to have those communications and develop internally, and that by fostering an environment of safetyism, that um, we're actually being prevented from reaching our full potential, essentially.
yeah, is it? Do you have a sense that safetyism is one of the unfortunate things that has washed up on the shores of humanity lately?
That is exactly my thought. I think that
Yeah.
and I think that it is natural that um, we as a species tend to overcorrect things. I think that
Mm,
we push this pendulum way too far back in the other direction, and it's hard for us to actually find a balance in the center.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Saturday Night Live, I just did a skit related to that. It's about these two young interns who are on a Starfleet ship, and you know the starship is about to head into a black hole, and the interns are very concerned because they've been spoken to very sharply in the midst of crisis. They've been spoken to very sharply, and now they feel like they've been gaslighted, and they demand an apology because they are hurting inside. And so, yeah, I think that there's there is a bit of a cultural trope around safetyism, but it's interesting too because I think there is also still like so much anxiety. And I was actually just talking about this with another um, conversationalist I just had on the podcast, Vince Cadlebeck. We were talking about how is there still so much anxiety when we have, especially like in the United States and Canada, so many people have so much more than what they need for survival. And yet we still have sort of
Mhm.
these very high levels of anxiety and sort of, I think along with that, very high levels of safetyism. I find that very curious as well. That to me really speaks to underlying mental, like there's something kind of fundamental mental health challenge
Yeah.
that is not, it's not the external world. It's something internal going on.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in this idea of disconnection. While we might have a lot in the sense of material things, I think a lot of us are actually disconnected from meaningful work and meaningful
Mm,
relationships and
mm,
meaningful contributions to society. And we're constantly being inundated with advertisements and with social media and the social sphere telling us how we should behave. Or a colleague of mine has a stepdaughter, and her stepdaughter came to her with a problem the other day, and she said, "Mom, people don't like my TikTok videos." And she kind of stopped and said, "Well, you're 6 years old. What the hell are you doing on TikTok?" You know, and it's just, there's this thing in social media for whatever reason that we're drawn to get likes, and we're drawn
mm,
to get on with all of the current trends. And so, my sense is that while we might have a lot of material goods and we might be living in excess of material goods, there's actually a scarcity of meaningful connection,
mm.
um, which
Yeah.
is kind of where I'm hoping that psychedelics are really going to help to start transform things. Because that's my personal experience, is that psychedelics are all about connectedness, and it's connecting you to yourself, it's connecting you to the world. It's, if you're using it in a recreational setting, it's connecting you with your friends, and it just
Connecting you to
helps.
joy.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
connecting you to fear, and connecting you to sadness, but it just ultimately connects you on a very deep level um that I think is missing in a
Mm.
lot of people's lives these days.
It's interesting when you talk about this piece about scarcity of meaning and, the the need that people are trying to fill with social media. Research has shown to us that the little red button, the little red icon that shows response just gives you the tiniest little dopamine hit, right?
Yeah,
Like research has shown that. When you go on Facebook and you see a red dot as compared to no dots, you get just a little nick of dopamine. And I know people who are like on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter all the time. And so they're getting these little dopamine hits. They're doing drugs essentially.
yeah,
But if I talk to them about doing psychedelics, they're like, "Oh, there's no way I would do psychedelics." It's like, but
yeah,
but you are doing drugs. There's a way in which you are doing drugs with social media, and they may or may not be serving you. And then
yeah.
there's a way that you could think about this with psychedelics that has a very high possibility of expanding you and serving you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And, I am a firm believer that it's important not to stigmatize things, and it's important to let people make their own choices. But certainly, I wonder how many people, if they were able to really think critically about their habits with social media, or, smoking tobacco, like there's so many things that people do that may not be serving them in the long term, but it serves, a short term need.
Mm,
um, and yeah,
yeah.
social media, it's something that is, I think it's a delicate balance. I personally really struggle with social media. Anytime that I've ever had, Instagram or Facebook, it's just like, or Twitter, I get stuck in these patterns of just habitually checking it. And it's like I don't have good self-control of my habits with social media, and that's why I choose not to use it. But certainly when I was a teenager, I chose not to use Facebook because I felt like I saw what all of these other people were doing, and then comparing my life to other people's lives, it just was really hard that I wasn't as, adventurous or athletic or
Mm,
whatever it was.
mm,
And
mm.
so for me, there's, both kind of like a negative mental health result, but then also this like addictive property that just kind of kept me coming back for more. And yeah, it just didn't serve me. So had to get
Yeah.
off.
It's interesting too, sort of thinking about this in the along the vein of sort of recalibrating how you view the world. Like, we can there's a way in which um paying attention first and foremost is necessary before you can recalibrate how you view the world or engage in the world. I wonder, as you think about yourself, you sound to me to be attentive, but I wonder if you feel yourself attentive and sort of how you got that way, and how you would, recommend other folks if they want to be more attentive. Like, what would be your suggestions for being so?
Yeah, attention is an interesting thing because I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder as a teenager, prescribed amphetamines,
Mm.
specifically Dexedrine for a decade. Um, but awareness has always been really important. So I guess I'm curious about the difference between attention and awareness. And I think
Mm.
it's really important to be aware of, how other people affect you, how you affect other people. A lot of times, it's so easy to just get caught up in your own kind of BS and not really be thinking about how you're impacting other people. And whether or not that's attention or awareness, I'm just not totally sure. But I definitely think that psychedelics help that. I think the reason that I've always been drawn to psychedelics is just that it increases your awareness of what is going on around you. And why I've always kind of shied away from substances like alcohol is that it tends to narrow that field of awareness and perception and just kind of
Mm.
makes me, and from my view, typically makes people extremely belligerent and loud and obnoxious. And that's why I tend to prefer things like psychedelics. Is just it makes you a little bit more aware of what's going on around you.
That is an interesting distinction between substances that expand your awareness and perhaps substances that contract your awareness. Because I do, for myself, I do find myself paying more attention to bias I have in favor of certain substances and bias I have against certain substances, and wanting to understand what is that about. Because I do think that, the degree to which psychedelics become more accessible is the degree to which drugs in general, substances in general, are destigmatized, right?
Yeah.
That we can't just sort of make psychedelics like the wonderful exception over here. It's either substances or it's not substances. So yeah, I do find myself sort of pointing out to myself, if you're gonna be down on cigarettes, people are gonna someone can say the same thing about LSD,
Yeah.
right? So it's important to sort of think about elevating that conversation across all substances, but making distinctions between the way that I experience some and the way I experience others. So I really appreciate that
Yeah.
distinction that you're making between sort of the awareness expansion and the awareness contraction with certain substances.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting, not contradictions, but one of the most interesting premises of Carl's book that I didn't necessarily agree with was, the idea that all drugs should be, hmm, how to say this? Essentially, that I think that one of the chapters on psychedelics was that a lot of psychedelics users tend to like evangelize psychedelics and discount the benefits of other substances like heroin or alcohol. And it made me think a lot about, why that might be. And certainly in my own past, I've definitely I've tended to judge things like cocaine and heroin and alcohol as substances that are bad, and psychedelics and cannabis as drugs that are good.
Mhm.
Um, and I've tried to move away from that thinking and that mentality, because I do think that there's benefits and there's pros and cons to all substance use,
Mhm.
but just trying to understand what the risks are and whether or not there's something to be said about um, like if there's an argument to be made that psychedelics should be legalized, and drugs like cocaine and heroin should continue to be criminalized. And my sense is that drug use should be a public health conversation, not a criminal discussion. And so all drugs should be decriminalized and regulated. Um, but at the same time, I wonder, like, is there something to be said about the consequences of using a substance like that forms a dependence? Because I think that the fact that something forms a dependence in your experience may also then to me, it almost suggests that there is more of a con of using that type of substance than using
Mhm.
something like psilocybin or LSD that does not form dependence.
Mhm.
And in my own experience, when I'm using drugs that are that do form dependence, like alcohol or nicotine and tobacco, the withdrawal experiences that I have, they kind of bring out a side of me that is not my best person. It's the, it's someone that I don't like to be. It really shines a light. It really takes the light away from the shadow.
Mhm.
Whereas using drugs like psilocybin or LSD, it tends to make me a lot more empathetic and open. And I like the person that I am on psychedelics more than I like the person who is on these other drugs. But
Yeah.
anyways,
But
it's
someone could get after you about cannabis though, because you're a friend of cannabis, and
yeah,
cannabis can form a dependence. So right there, you end up like
yeah,
someone being able to get after you about that. Like,
yeah,
well, then why is this drug that can form a dependence, better than this drug that can form a dependence, right? And
yeah,
cannabis has its toxicity as well. So I think that's the part of it. Is it's not so much that I would sort of advocate personally, because if I state my situation, I still get a little clutch in my heart when I think about the notion of someone doing heroin. It scares me. It it
yeah,
it does, and I do appreciate Dr. Hart sort of talking about this in a way that I can sort of hear it differently. But I will tell you, when I first started talking about what I was reading with Carl Hart, my wife was like, "Are you going to start doing cocaine?" Like, she immediately freaked out.
yeah,
Like, and I totally understand that. I do. I
yeah,
understand that. Um, I just haven't known anyone that has positive use. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just
yeah.
saying I personally am not familiar with it. And also for me, it might be harder for me to have positive use with some substances than with others. And I
Yeah.
think that's the awareness to bring for me to this conversation.
Yeah, see, I have some people that are extremely close to me who are heroin users, and
Mm,
it has always been a very interesting conversation because they're comfortable enough with me to disclose that, and they've actually used me as a I guess as a safety because I'm aware of their substance use. They had like a two key safe, and if they ever
hmm,
felt like they were slipping into a pattern of abuse, then they would give me one of their keys so that they would not be able to access their stash for a sufficient period of time. And just it but for me, the fear has always been about supply and safety of supply, and just not knowing if that next batch
mm,
is going to be um, a batch that is going to kill them. um,
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
and so for me, I think that if it was regulated and you were actually able to go and get a known safe supply of heroin, I think that I'd be a little bit more comfortable knowing that people are using that. And for me, it's just not understanding this like risk benefit ratio. But everyone has a different risk profile, as is becoming extremely clear through this pandemic. um,
Well, and I would say that that applies to psychedelics as well. I've been doing psychedelic experiences for 2.5 years. I don't know where my substances come from.
yeah,
I don't test them before I take them. I
yeah,
have to trust the person who helps facilitate this for me, that they trust the person who facilitated it for them, who
yeah,
trust the person who facilitated it for them. Like, I have no idea, right? And that's actually something that I remember raising to you. Had you explored, particularly as a company that is producing psychedelics, had you explored blockchain yet, and the contribution that blockchain might be able to contribute to trust and safety for psychedelics at scale? I just wonder if that's actually a piece of conversation we can have, or we're sort of not there yet.
yeah. So I listened to the first half of that blockchain podcast that you'd linked to me, and so I really
Mhm.
appreciate that. I still feel like I'm not fully like I don't fully understand the ins and outs of blockchain in order to fully grasp whether or not it's going to become an important, I guess, supply chain management tool
Mhm.
in for safety of supply. And so I guess when I think about a regulated market, and I think about the FDA or Health Canada putting out market approvals to be able to market these products, the manufacturers of those products would need to have a full quality management system with batch
Mhm.
release testing and
Mhm.
recall processes and everything. And so I think that the process of legitimizing these drugs will result in a safe market authorized product. I'd be very curious, and maybe you're aware of this. Have there ever been discussions about blockchain being used like in the underground market for safe supply?
Yeah,
Have you heard
that's
about
very
any of
interesting.
this?
Yeah, I have not heard about it in the underground. I actually have heard about it though at pharma companies who
Yeah.
are using blockchain. And for folks who are not familiar with this, I'll include a link in the show notes to a conversation with Curtis Chappell on blockchain and psychedelics at scale, which is a pretty good 101 for understanding how blockchain and this technology might be useful in psychedelics. What I have encountered and what I am continuing to explore are pharma companies, cannabis companies as well, who are using blockchain to validate that the cannabis that you think you're getting is the actual cannabis that you're getting, and being able to do that with a very high level of database security, so that the data can't be tampered with once the cannabis is confirmed. And then pharma companies who are also using blockchain to verify their products so that they can't be counterfeited, which I think also is very important in psychedelics as well. So I haven't heard about it in the underground, though I think it would be incredibly interesting. But because these technologies are typically used, particularly blockchain for supply chain at this point, it's very nascent technology, and so when it's applied for companies that are really going to use it at scale, so to make it worthwhile to sort of build out this complicated technology. So like Walmart is using it, for example.
Okay.
Salesforce actually just partnered up with a blockchain for its customer data at scale. So there are more scale projects that are happening right now. But
Yeah.
I do think it's actually very, very interesting to think about. I live in Oregon and I grow my mushrooms, and I have a little co-op that I share my mushrooms with, and I want people to understand that my mushrooms and my psilocybin are very reliable. And so, when I hand you, a little vial of psilocybin, there's a QR code on that, and you can scan that code, and then you can sort of see the history of my mushrooms coded into the blockchain, immutable, can't be changed, noted forever. And you can sort of trust the transparency that I'm providing you. I think that can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, certainly the idea that this ledger exists on all of these devices, and it's just it's such a it's such a powerful tool and such a powerful technology. And it's interesting that the blockchain technology has just had such a rich history in substance use and substance and I guess illicit substance
Mhm.
sales so far.
Yeah.
Through
Yeah,
the Silk Road and
yeah, it's been used,
yeah,
and I'll link to that as well. For folks who don't know what the Silk Road is, and you have blockchain and crypto being used illicitly to move substances around the world,
yeah,
but we don't have it yet for substances legally, like the ones that you're producing, to
yeah,
be produced in a way that is transparent. We can verify and trust the psilocybin that's coming out of PsyGen, or the DMT in the future that will come out of PsyGen, or whatever else PsyGen might produce.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm just be really curious to see how this evolves with producers, and we'll certainly want to check back with you about that going forward.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious how it would work. Like, is this going to be, where does it start and where does it end? Do you have blockchain, from the raw materials all the way
Mhm.
through to the finished product, or do you have,
Absolutely.
and so then you would need to have everyone in your supply chain, agree to get on board with this blockchain
Yep.
technology, which is, I feel like that, maybe it's a hurdle, but maybe it's not. Maybe there's a bunch of benefits in it. It actually reduces the costs and, improves your traceability. I don't know, but
That's so I encourage you to listen to the next half
yeah,
of the
okay,
conversation with Curtis, because he
I will
talks
finish
about
it.
exactly this. I mean, if Cadbury can do it with cacao producers in Papua New Guinea, surely we can
Yeah,
figure this out. If Australia beef producers can do it for beef being sold in China, which
yeah,
it's not just one country's regulators, but multiple regulators, and throw shipping in the middle, I'm sure we can figure this out.
yeah. Well, yeah, apologies that I didn't manage to finish the episode before today, but
You didn't do
I
your
do look
homework,
forward to
Danny.
finishing it. Yeah, I apologize, Tammy.
No, I'm not fussing at you. You're a busy guy running a company. So I appreciate you actually being just willing to just kind of talk this out, because you're the first kind of producer of psychedelics I've been able to, even sort of have this seed conversation with. So yeah, very interesting. I think Danny, we're coming to the end of our time together. And I think, sort of the last thing that I wanted to chat with you about is, particularly as a CEO of a company that is producing psychedelics primarily for research purposes, right? You're providing them to labs and institutions so they can do research, which is sort of institutionalized, medicalized approach to psychedelics.
Mm.
Um, but what I've read of you and seen of you is that you also want to see other access points for psychedelics, and you want to see those access points as sort of primary as the sort of medical therapeutic access point. I'm just wondering if you can say more about that, especially because it's kind of surprising to hear that from a guy who runs a company that is like part of the success of your organization is going to be contingent upon the success of medicalized psychedelics. And I'm hearing you say, yeah, but it shouldn't be the only way, or maybe even the primary way. So I'm just curious to hear you talk more about that.
So, I, there's a lot to unpack here, and I feel like we could probably have an hour and a half conversation just about this topic. So maybe an idea for a follow-up conversation. But
For sure.
the big thing for me is just that in my own personal history, and most of the people that I know who have been experimenting with psychedelics for the last 15 or 20 years, most people would not consider themselves to have an indication that would, result in a psychiatrist prescribing psilocybin to them. But they do all agree that they're very beneficial tools for their own personal development and mental health. And right now, I guess what my hope is that we can try and help blend this Eastern and Western philosophy, where we can try and uncover evidence for preventative medicine with psychedelics.
Mhm.
It's tough because I just don't really know what regulatory framework exists right now where you would be able to market something like psilocybin or MDMA or LSD for preventative mental health issues. And I don't know if that exists in the FDA or Health Canada's, regulations.
So you mean
Um,
thinking about it like a supplement, like instead of waiting to get a diagnosis, you actually use it essentially like, to promote your mental wellness?
yeah, exactly. Help build resiliency in the mind, help prevent people
Mhm.
from falling down into the pits of despair. Something that I'm really passionate about, like as my father was dying, and there's a lot of work right now with psilocybin for end of life anxiety. But what about all the families of, like I had a very unique experience with my father's passing, relative to the other people in my family who I think had a harder time accepting that his time had come and that the end of his life was here. Whereas the experiences that I had with psychedelics really helped me accept that this is just a transition and that, you know, that his spirit will go wherever his spirit decides to go or whatever
Mhm.
comes after, who knows. But, um, you know, as it currently stands, I would have needed a diagnosis in order to be
Mhm.
prescribed psilocybin or LSD therapy for that experience of connecting with my father at the end of his life.
Mhm.
And this is somewhere that I could see psychedelic medicine going, where we have people who are dying and they and their family get to take a medicine session together and really connect, closely so that they can help. Well, it's like I said before, I think that the anxiety and the depression that we're seeing that are so rampant is all about disconnection. And so if you
Yeah.
can use these drugs to connect on a deeper level, then I just think that there could be a whole lot more healing and it could reinvent how we approach death as a species, or rather as a society, because I know
Yeah.
other cultures approach death very differently.
Wouldn't that,
Um,
you're right. Wouldn't that be amazing? I've had experience with hospice a number of times as I've supported relatives who have passed. Um, and wouldn't it be incredible if part of the hospice experience was, you know, in-home care for the person who's transitioning, sort of medicines that are provided, and then would you also like a medicine group, a psychedelic medicine group with your family, and we have a guide who can take you through that. Like that would be an incredible addition to hospice.
yeah, I think so. I mean, it would be so profound for all of the survivors because at the end of the day, it can be a lot of trauma can exist after you lose someone, and just dealing with their passing into whatever comes next it can be really hard for people to kind of grapple with.
Yeah,
um
it occurs to me that death is actually an experience for the living.
Yeah.
right? The dying is the experience of the person who's transitioning, but the death
Yeah.
itself is the experience of the living, because we're the ones here sort of
Yeah.
grappling with that separation, that
Yeah.
loss. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, it's my hope that we can kind of move through this medicalization framework into something that's more, generally acceptable for people, to use psychedelics just for creative purposes, for, building resiliency, for recreation, because I do think that that's a valid intention. But, you know, I have to be very cautious because I don't want to freak out the regulator. I want to make sure that Health Canada and the FDA know that we're looking to work with them and that we're looking to help evolve thinking and drug policy, and that we're not just trying to, you know, um,
Create a
I guess,
psilocybin free for all.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense. And I do think that, I've heard Dr. Hart say that the reason he supports decriminalization before legalization is because, particularly, Western society, the US and Canada, for example, we need to learn to behave responsibly with
yeah,
drugs. So, before we just sort of make them freely available, we could make it so that you aren't punished, and then you are educated, and then they are available.
yeah. I think the piece of education is so important. My own experience when I was 15 and I first took mushrooms. I had an older cousin who was, 20 at the time, who kind of helped not guide me through the process, but kind of prepare me for what I was going to experience. And then I experienced it with a couple of my friends. Um, but I felt very fortunate to have what I perceived as a mentor guide me through the process of substance use and how to do this safely and how to do this responsibly. And I could see that, you know, I guess, juxtaposed between, or two other 15 and 16-year-olds who had they were just getting into drug use because they were curious and they were experimenting, and they had no
Mhm.
one to guide them or mentor them through that process. And
Mm.
the difference in outcomes when you actually have someone who's available to help you understand how to use these substances properly. I say
Mhm.
properly, but
Let's say
to
productively.
maximize benefit productively. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that education piece is so key.
Yeah. I think you've left us with a couple of really great thoughts, Danny. Medicine groups for hospice, mentors for substance exploration. Um, I really appreciate the way that you think about engaging substances. The fact that you are a dude who makes drugs, you're thinking quite deeply about what that means for society. I personally appreciate that. So I really just thank you for the time that you've spent with us. Thank you for sharing ideas and just exploring, just open-ended exploring in this conversation. I really appreciate it, and I do hope we get to come back together and talk about sort of how things are evolving. Once we are on the other side of some regulatory shifts in a positive direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for hosting all of these conversations and for giving me an opportunity to speak with you. It's been a pleasure to
Uh,
connect with you over the last couple weeks.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, Danny. Until next time.
Thanks, Tammy.
That wraps up another episode of Keys to the Kingdom. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the show notes for resources we discussed, and follow the Keys conversation on Twitter at Psychedelics Key. Until we meet again, remember, you are connected, you are love, and the kingdom is yours.